on the screen. So I think we're just about coming up to 4 o'clock, but we've got a few minutes, 4 p.m. GMT, I should say. Thank you to Sarah Thomas for joining us from a different time zone, and really appreciate that. And if anyone needs to check any tech, or I'm not sure that anyone has something to share, but I'll just make it so that everyone can share their screen if necessary. But yeah, thank you everyone for coming along with enough time, and Delphi has warned me not to curse it, but so far the tech is all working. But do let me know, any panelists or attendees in the chat. Delphi will check it if there's any problems or any issues. And the way we did it last time was that if anyone wanted to jump in at any point, you can sort of message Delphi in the chat, or stick your Zoom hand up, or put your actual hand up, and then we can sort of, the discussion can flow, as it were. But without further ado, I'd just like to say hello. My name is Rachel, and I'm a PhD student in Hispanic Studies at the universities of Cardiff and Exeter. And I'm really, really thrilled that this event is taking place today. And I'm fortunate enough to have been supported by Pragda Spanish Film Club, which I'll talk a bit about briefly in a second. My universities, my funding body, the AHRC, and finally my supervisors, Sally Faulkner, and also Ryan Prout, to be able to put on this kind of virtual series of film screenings, a Spanish Film Festival, as it were, called Screening the Child. And also thank you to all the speakers, my colleagues, some friends are willing to join us today. And I've come across cinema and Spanish cinema studies with all of you in different ways. So working with Sally as my supervisor, and also volunteering for Ben in his pop-up cinema. So we'll hear more about that shortly. And I've read a lot of all your work. So thank you very much for supporting me as an early career postgraduate researcher. So Spanish Film Club is an initiative by Pragda, and it offers grants twice a year to help high schools and universities bring contemporary Spanish and Latin American cinema to campuses. So obviously we're doing that virtually this year, but it's got the overall aim of introducing students to the language and cultures of these territories. So the ultimate goal is to kind of introduce the students and a generally more broader audience to cultures of Ibero-american countries, and to create a stable exhibition platform of the latest Spanish and Portuguese language cinema. And also Catalan language, as we're seeing with Pa Negra and Estiu 1993. So it's it's been a really good thing. So it's my great pleasure today to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Delphi May, who will be chairing this discussion. So thank you so much, Delphi, for being so willing to do that. Now, Delphi recently completed a co-supervised PhD funded by the AHRC SWWDTP, under the guidance of Professor Sally Faulkner, University of Exeter, and Dr. Simón Knox from the University of Reading. And the title of her thesis is Hybrid Acts, Representations of Chineseness and Chinese Immigration on Spanish Film and TV. So the doctorate is interdisciplinary in nature, and it draws on both scholarship published from a modern languages background and from the field of film and television studies. So thank you so much, Delphi, for being so willing and enthusiastic to chair this discussion. And it's my great pleasure to hand over to you to host today.
Oh, thanks, Rachel, for that very comprehensive introduction. Yeah, it's very well formulated. Thank you very much. And obviously, just to kind of continue this kind of stage of thanks, obviously, I would like to thank all of the panel speakers for joining us today and for sharing their thoughts and insights on this rather really powerful film with us. I want to also thank everyone who's in the chat or who's attending this event via the Zoom webinar format. So thank you, please, for finding the time to do this. It means a lot. As ever, please do feel free to put questions, any thoughts throughout the Q&A, or into the chat, as we'd love for this to be a really interactive and vibrant discussion of this film. And just to reiterate, just in case for those of you just popping in, this event is being recorded, so it can be available as an asynchronous teaching or educational resource. Okay, so without any more delay, I will introduce today's panelists and the film. So as we know, today we are discussing Estiu, or Verano 1993, or Summer 1993. So in the summer of 93, following the death of her parents to AIDS, 6-year-old Frida is forced from Barcelona to the Catalan provinces to live with her aunt and uncle, who take the position of her legal guardians. Punctuated by moments of youthful exuberance and mature ruminations, as Rachel's quite nicely put it. This coming of age drama is a very moving snapshot of being a child in what is an adult world, and is invariably supported and anchored by flawless performances by its two young stars. So to move on to today's speakers, first we have Stuart Davis. Hello. Who's senior lecturer in Spanish at Girton College in Cambridge. Currently, Stuart devotes 3/4 of his time to being a lecturer and the other quarter to admissions and outreach work, as in the position of admissions tutor for art subjects at Girton. Stuart's research interests lie in contemporary Spanish textual and visual culture, with particular interest in memory, shame, and other emotions. So thank you for joining us, Stuart. We also have Raquel Martínez Martín, who is a Spanish teaching assistant and PhD candidate at Strathclyde University, where she tutors first and second year language classes together with cultural studies modules in second year and honours. She gained her MEd in Spanish linguistics and pedagogy from the University of La Rioja in Spain in 2015. Her main research focus is Spanish contemporary cinema and Spanish crisis films in particular. So thank you for joining us, Raquel. We have also Sarah Wright, whose research focuses on Spanish cinema, theatre and cultural studies. She's Professor of Hispanic Studies at Royal Holloway. Sarah's book, The Child in Spanish Cinema, it was supported by an AHRC fellowship in 2010 over 2011 and was published in 2013 with Manchester University Press. And a book that very much helped me with my thesis, by the way, Sarah. So thank you, and thank you for joining today. We have Sally Faulkner, who, well, Rachel and I know very well. She's Assistant Deputy Vice Chancellor and Professor of Hispanic Studies and Film Studies at the University of Exeter. Sally's research largely focuses on Spanish cinema, where she has particular interest in film and politics, especially under the dictatorship and during the transition to democracy. Also film aesthetics, so the practice of close reading and questions of intermediality, and film theory, specifically post-colonial theory and gender. So thank you very much, Sally, for making the time. We have Ben Rive. I'm so sorry if I pronounced that wrong.
It's okay, it's Rive, but it's
Rive,
fine.
I'm so sorry. He's founder and creative director of the Penarth-based Snowcat Cinema. So Snowcat, as Rachel's mentioned, is a pop-up cinema screening cult, lesser known and lost classics. They offer immersive cinema experiences and have become a focal point for social cinephiles. And Ben often runs discussion sessions following film screenings and has a broad knowledge of and love of a whole range of films. So thank you, Ben, for joining us. And finally, we have Dr. Sarah Thomas, who is an associate professor of Hispanic studies at Brown University. She works on contemporary fiction and film from Spain with a secondary interest in Latin American cinema. Her research is especially concerned with literature, cinema, and visual culture emerging from post-dictatorship societies in the Spanish-speaking world. Her first book, Inhabiting the In-Between Childhood and Cinema in Spain's Long Transition, was published in 2019 by the University of Toronto Press in its Iberic series. So thank you very much, Sarah, for joining us, and thank you to everyone. So I think, you know, kind of on the back of what's been asked of us today, and it seemed to work well in the last session, for us to sort of kick off with just some opening remarks, our initial thoughts about the film. So I just wanted to ask everyone really, what were your first reactions and thoughts and feelings, you know, both throughout viewing the film and after obviously the film's ended, which for me was a particular point of intense emotion, as Rachel's got evidence of that recorded on her phone of me crying down. I said, I hate you, Rachel, you've made me cry. So I just wanted to really kick off here really with kind of emotive, effective, I suppose, responses to the film. If anybody would like to start with this.
Shall I go?
Yeah, Ben, please.
The awkward silence. I can't take it.
Oh, please, no.
So I come at this film from I think I'm the only non-academic on the panel, so I kind of come at this from a slightly different angle. I think that I saw it in April of 2018. It was about 6 months before the general release. I saw a preview screening of it at the BFI South Bank in London, and I went into it on the basis that I saw that it was set in 1993, and I'm a hopeless nostalgic romantic. Any film that kind of feels like it's set within my lifetime but in a different part of the world, I'm drawn to, because I want to see what I think of what I was doing in 1993 and what my world looked like in 1993, and it's then interesting to see what Spain looked like at that point. And the other thing I knew about the film before I went into it was that I read the little bit of blurb in our guide to the weekend that I was at, and it said that it was delicate and dreamlike, and they were two words that I like films like that. I'm a sucker for slow films that are dreamy and that a lot of people say they're boring and nothing happens. I love those films. And if you couple that with it being 1993, and then from the perspective of a child, you've got me at the start. I'm very happy about that as a film synopsis to start me off. And I went in not knowing anything about the director, about the fact it was autobiographical. I just went in to watch a film about a 6-year-old girl in 1993, and it blew me away. The performances of the kids are just second to none, and another thing that I've got a real soft spot for is films from the perspective of children of about that age. I think that's the hopeless nostalgic in me as well. I want to be 6 again, so it's nice to watch other kids mucking about and doing what kids do. So yeah, I went in not knowing very much, and when I came out, the first thing I did was, like we all do these days, I jumped on my phone and went on Wikipedia and found out about the director, and was then astonished to find out that it was as autobiographical as it is. And since then, in preparation for this, I've seen some really interesting stuff that's on the physical release of this from Spain, of some photos of the director and how accurate the representation of them is in the film. So when I came to rewatch the film earlier this week, so I hadn't seen it for 3 years, I remembered a lot of it, but I then read more about her, and it was even more striking then to watch it again from the perspective of it being autobiographical and quite frighteningly close to what actually happened. So I fell in love with it straight away. It ticked all the boxes for me. So I'm very glad to be able to come and talk about it. It's a good film choice. Thank you, Rachel. So there's me.
Thank you, Ben. Does anybody else want to sort of share their thoughts about the film? Sarah, hi.
Yeah, I saw it at the BFI as well, so that's kind of interesting.
Were you at the screening days? Yeah.
But I was at the London Film Festival, I think.
Ah, okay.
I think that's where it was, and it was in NFT 3, which is one of the smallest screening spaces, but it was absolutely packed, and everyone was just completely rapt. You could honestly, you could have heard a pin drop through the whole of the performance, and then at the end, when the lights came up, just looked around the room, there was just this glistening tears, just everyone just sitting in this kind of community of crying. So yeah, it had a very big effect, I think, on everybody there. Because I went to it with slightly more preconceptions because of the idea of the child and all of that, but still, I was very impressed with the film.
Cool, excellent. And anybody else want to kind of, Sally? Right?
I want to join the conversation about memorable screenings, because Rachel put on a screening of this at a rural film festival in the middle of Dartmoor in Devon. It was similarly well attended and admired, and there were similar amounts of tears, so it was special. I did want to just link up another couple of questions, because I know I hope some people listening to this may have attended the Pan Negre, the black bread round table and discussion. So I wanted to thank Rachel and congratulate her on how well these films sit together. And for me, this film is rather like the antidote to the explicit violence of the earlier one. But also, since watching that earlier film and preparing for this, I did some, and this may link up to what Stuart's doing, some work with local schools on a film that's on the Spanish A-level syllabus, one of a number, but the one I'm thinking of is Pan's Labyrinth, Laberinto del Fauno, which also has a child protagonist, and for me, quite explicit violence also. So it's brilliant to see a different approach. And there are some undergraduate students, I think, on this call who are particularly interested in the representation of the child, and who read all of the Sarah's on the call's books, and all of the articles written by people on this call. So I hope that this is useful for them. I think I just wanted to make, if I could, 2 points, and then we'll see what comes up in the discussion. But the first is, of course, the richness and the strikingness of the portrayal of the child, and the performances drawn from those child actors is fascinating and so convincing. But in order to understand the film, we have to understand the dialogue. And of course, it's a Catalan language film. There are 4 million native Catalan speakers. However good you are at Spanish, it's really quite difficult to understand the critical, the whispered conversations that we hear. We're really, really reliant on the subtitles in this film. So I wanted to bring up subtitling and their importance. And then the second thing that might come up is, of course, it's sadly the case that the film is so relevant in the current coronavirus context. And I think that it's important and fascinating for us to see this portrait of social attitudes to illness and guilt and responsibility and so on. So it's become, I think, newly relevant. There's lots more to say, but I'll stop there, and I'm looking forward to further debate and questions from the audience.
Absolutely. So does anyone kind of want to touch on either of Sally's very incisive points, either about subtitling or the position that the film might have today in light of the COVID-19 pandemic and different discourses that are arising about illness, chronic illness, how it's received politically? Does anybody kind of have anything? Did anyone make any similar insights? Or
I could maybe speak to that, because I also had a similar. It was very interesting, I think, as Ben said and as Sally said, to go back and watch this film several years later. I first saw it in the summer of 2017 in Spain, when it had just been released in a very small theater. And I was finishing my book on children in the Spanish transition cinema, and everyone had said, you've got to see this film, you've got to see this film. And I saw it and I loved it and I wept, and as everyone has described. But watching it 4 years later almost, and in the current context of the pandemic, I was really struck by that parallel. I think partly because, you know, I had seen the film in a very tunnel vision. I was at the end of a project. I was thinking about this, you know, cinema, these sort of iconic forebears of like El Espíritu de la Colmena by Victor Erice, Cría Cuervos by Carlos Saura, that I know several of us have written about this film with Cría Cuervos, which is like a really rich and productive pairing. And mostly focused on the really nuanced representation of childhood, which I think is so striking, and the performances of the children, and, you know, the sort of thinking about what children see and know, and how much of the adult world they understand when adults think they don't, had been sort of my initial focus. And I think those are key parts of the film. But seeing it again, I was struck really by the portrait of grief that this film gives us. And that the sort of child character who, when you first see Frida, I remember feeling a kind of sense of nervous trepidation the whole film, thinking like, is she going to do something terrible? What's going to happen to the cousin? Like what you know, there was this sort of, once you've seen it and you know that everything's okay at the end, I think you also have a kind of different appreciation of the emotional resonance of just how she's sort of trapped in this sort of solitary grieving process, that what she most wants is connection to others, and yet her grief sort of inhibits her from making those connections, and it's this vicious cycle. And sort of personal note, I this weekend spent 2 hours at a Zoom funeral service for the mother of my childhood best friend who died of COVID. So for me, it was like, oh, like childhood, lost mother, illness, and second to last scene, which is sort of the pivotal moment when Marta is helping her prepare the school materials. And Frida asks about the virus and asks these questions. Was the doctor new? You know, why did she die? And Marta's response of, well, it's a new virus. We don't really understand it. It was just so striking.
Yeah.
And I get emotional. It was very, very resonant for me personally, but I think, you know, not just in my own circle, but thinking of how many people, both the AIDS epidemic and the COVID epidemic, you know, how many children like Frida there are, how many people like Frida there are. So that was really powerful for me.
I think just to kind of jump in on that, really, the thing that was most powerful to me, and the reason why I had such a strong emotional response to this film, was, I think some may interpret it, I don't know, but some may interpret the ending as kind of like her grief coming out. That's the moment of catharsis, you know, that's it. But to me, I was saying to Rachel when we were messaging earlier, that for me, that signaled the start of something, yes, kind of cathartic in one way and a release, but actually a process of something that's quite damaging and traumatic. You know, it's kind of the start of the post-trauma phase, if you see what I mean. And obviously the fade to black and her, you can still hear her crying, signals to us that these awakenings that we might have as young people, as children, don't stop there. They never stop, they're perpetual, you know. And to kind of bring a personal note into it, that kind of is tangentially linked to this notion of illness and shame and grief in another way. You know, I've been through a grieving process this year because I've got a chronic illness, and I was diagnosed at the age of 26 with something that's life-changing. You know, for me, you know, seeing kind of that idea of it being perpetual, and you never stop learning these lessons, and these things in life don't stop when you hit 18. They don't stop when you're notionally out of this stage of childhood or adolescence, really struck a chord with me. So I didn't interpret the film as this is kind of like, you know, this is her cathartic moment, it's coming out, you know, let it all out, that's it. You know, it was the start of something actually post-traumatic that is damaging, that we don't see, obviously, because the film stops there. And that's really why, yeah, I think the word that kept bashing around in my head was, this is perpetual. It doesn't stop when you're a child. You know, when you hit 18, we are privy to these awakenings and pivotal moments in life forever. So that's something that I took away from this film that was really powerful.
The director is still processing by virtue of the fact she's making films about this 15, 16 years later.
Obviously, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, and it's something really strangely that I never thought about before, quite like that. And at the age of 28, that might sound a bit strange, but yeah, it really struck a chord with me in that way. So yeah, just to pick up on both Sally and Sarah's points there, that was you know, the impact it had on me. But I don't know if anyone feels similarly towards it, or they interpreted the ending in a different way.
No, I think if I can step in, yeah, I really agree with that, actually, because I have to confess, I do not remember watching this film for how and where it came across my desk, so to speak. Or I must have watched it at home. I must have watched it on DVD, I seem to think, and I know I must have come at it because of teaching films like Cría Cuervos and El Espíritu de la Colmena, and doing lots of outreach work with El Laberinto del Fauno, as Sally suggested earlier on. You know, so you know, real interest in that. And also actually another interest in my teaching has been looking at AIDS narratives from the 80s and 90s and teaching on a paper, a comparative studies paper, where we look at contagion. Believe me, that's really changed with coronavirus as well. That's how we talk about that these days. And so whenever it was that this film came to my attention, and I sadly can't remember how and when, I really wanted to see it and did. But also from a personal angle, because I've witnessed my sister's loss of her husband 9 years ago to cancer, and my nephew was a little bit older than Frida is. I mean, he was 9 years old. But everything you just said, Delphi, really resonated with, you know, seeing that within my family, you know, extended family, and they're still dealing with that now, and still, you know, he's 18, but he's still, you know, having to work through this. And so as Ben just said, you know, this is Carla Simón, you know, creating this autobiographical film, and I think, you know, it is very affective. You know, I think I watched it again yesterday for the first time for a long time, and found myself probably crying more than I had done previously when I'd watched this film. I think being a parent doesn't help. Kind of, you know, you really, you know, I'm sure anybody who's been around children a lot will find also, you know, that that those performances, I think it was Sally picked up the question about performance, wasn't it, and the naturalness, or maybe it's Sarah now, apologies, I forget. But the you know, the acting, when it is acting, because it's not always acting, it seems, isn't it, just resonates so much with my own experiences with children, and you know, all of those kind of petulant moments, all of those kind of stomping and crying, and you know, I don't want them to go, and chasing them down the road, and you know, and that moment when Frida, you know, is all guns blazing to leave in the middle of the night, and she gets to the end of the road, and the car goes past, and you realise that actually she hasn't got the gumption to do it, and hides, and then kind of storms back in, going, I'm going to go in the morning when the lights, you know. I just laughed out loud at that moment, because it just seems so realistic of what, you know, a headstrong young child would do and would say. And you know, so it'd be interesting to know how much of this really, you know, is a recreation. And we know that the setting, for example, isn't it, is part of that recreation of Simón's own childhood and her youth. So for me, yeah, you know, academically, I was really interested, as you know, as you may know from the essay I had published, you know, comparing it with Cría Cuervos. And can I just give a quick shout out to Rachel's essay that came out very recently in Forum for Modern Languages Studies. It's fantastic, and I loved it, talking about play and creativity and power, etc. So you know, I think academically I came at it, you know, from a slightly different angle than I did personally, but yeah, it's one of my favorite films, I have to say.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there any other thoughts? Kind of, yeah, Raquel, hello.
Hi, sorry, not much to add. So I'm just going to try to give my own emotional perspective, as I see that everyone's doing. I actually saw this a few years ago, like some of the panelists, before it was released in the UK. I watched it at the Scottish Mental Health Arts Festival, which I didn't know anything about. So I just went there, of course, because this is a Spanish Catalan film, and I went there with my friends to have a nice evening out. It completely destroyed us in a good way. But it won the Best Feature Film. which I think is completely deserved. And the producer Valerie Delphi was there just to talk about a few things and the process of acting and everything, which was very interesting. But for me, as a child myself in Spain in the 90s, I'm very interested in the way that Frida discovers things in terms of and picking up on the theme of HIV and the virus, because this is something that has been portrayed recently in another film called Las Niñas. I'm actually from Zaragoza myself, so it's like seeing my own childhood on screen. But I remember being there in the 90s, also being like I like going back to that time of my childhood as well, and being at the health center with my mom and seeing all these posters like see that, no that, and I was like, what's that? What was that supposed to mean? And there was talk of the virus everywhere, but as a child or as children, we really didn't know anything about it, and I thought that was quite interesting. I think that someone else mentioned before how Frida, I think it was Sally, how Frida can't hear the adults as well, and how all these adult conversations are like out of reach for us. And I thought that was very interesting, because although I don't feel personally that we are invited to fully identify with Frida all the time, because obviously she does things that we may or may not question, but I feel that I'm in that position where I don't know everything that's going on in the film. But it's one of my favorite films as well. It's fantastic.
May I come in, Delphi, actually?
Rachel, yeah, of course, yeah, absolutely.
I'm not officially on the panel, but because I'm taking furious notes from you all, because it's very useful for my writing. But I just wanted to pick up on something Raquel said, actually, and what Ben said about this kind of nostalgia. And I remember watching it in Chagford in Dartmoor with Sally and Enrique, I think, our colleague. And afterwards, we were talking a lot about when we sort of...
Oh, no.
Element of nostalgia and how different parts of it are bringing that up, and especially if watching it as a Spanish spectator or a British-born spectator, you start to recognise things that Enrique was telling us about, how one scene they're dancing to Bon Bon Chip, Toma Mucha Fruta, which was kind of this iconic song advert in the 90s, and I didn't know that. So the film continues to be really interesting for me as a learning experience as well. And then coupled with this kind of nostalgic, dreamlike sort of the things that Ben was saying, I imagine it resonates differently in different audience contexts. And again, with what Sally was saying about these whispered conversations and what was actually known and what was taught to children, this is something that's come up with interviews on my fieldwork about what was actually being told and what was being explained about the virus to children and to adults, actually. So it puts lots of scenes, especially Stuart talks about this in his piece about the scene in the butcher's shop. I think it really speaks to this idea of what was being understood, what was known, and the way that the camera remains at a height level of Frida, I think, is really interesting. I'm sure Stuart will talk about that because it's such a good scene. But yeah, Raquel, what you were saying about the nostalgia, really important in terms of Las Niñas as well. Thanks.
Can I just say something, Rachel? I know that I'm chairing this and probably meant to be kind of overseeing things rather than actually opening my mouth too much. But I think I really want to pick up on this kind of idea of our, as children, kind of our first contact, so to speak, with phenomena such as AIDS, and I remember quite clearly my first sort of contact with it, or knowledge or awareness of it, was in this country, at least, with Freddie Mercury's death. And I remember, kind of asking my dad, like, oh, why did he die? What was wrong with him? And him not really be able to explain it to me, to somebody who was so very young, right? And the thing that really struck with me was it was just such a, I think, to use kind of Rachel's terms, as a learning experience, it was a really visceral and honest attempt to tell a story from from like the ground level, if I can say it like that, like not that doesn't center on a high profile person who dies of AIDS, right? This is somebody who was orphaned technically by the loss of both their parents, this disease that happened to so many people. That's told kind of very honestly, very viscerally, from like a grounded perspective, that doesn't focus on somebody who is well known, who's high profile, who's idolized, admired, or whatever. I'm not saying that that's wrong, but to me, that's what really struck. This was a really honest attempt to unearth these stories and create this learning experience now, you know, of something that was so tragic. That's what really struck with me as well. But just to pick up on both of what you said. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, kind of pick up on that if that's okay, Delphi. Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think there's a kind of narrative. Well, I think one of the really interesting things about this film, of course, is that it's picking up a narrative about AIDS, which is not about homosexuality.
Yeah.
And you know, I'm not sure how reliable statistics are, but we're told, aren't we, that Spain has some of the highest AIDS rates, HIV rates, due to drug abuse. And
yeah,
you know, and this is the background, isn't it, to this film. And the other thing, of course, is that so many of those kinds of narratives, especially around that time, as you're saying, are around victims and victimhood. Like you said, Freddie Mercury, and before that, people like what's his name, Rock Hudson, isn't it? And of course, I'm trying to remember what year the film Philadelphia came out of Hollywood.
92, 91, I want to say. I don't know.
Yeah, same here. Yeah, you know, so the big Hollywood representation of suffering and death through this disease. And this terrible condition, and at the minute, so I don't know if any of you have watched or are watching It's a Sin, you know, the channel.
Oh God.
Talking about nostalgia, and you know, and in many ways that's trying to do that. You know, it's educating its audience, and I feel like it's targeted partly at an audience that was not alive at that time. You know, this is what the AIDS narrative was about at the time. This is what people, you know, thought and believed. Aren't they silly? You know, this is crazy. And it also I think it's an amazing series. It does lots of very good things, and it's also very, you know, emotional. But at the same time, it does also thrive off that sense of victim narrative, perhaps problematically. So I think you know, this film doesn't do that, and that partly reflects Carla Simón's own experience, doesn't it? She says, doesn't she, that oh, there's a chat. Yeah, 1993.
Thank you.
She notes. Oh yeah, 93. Of course. Sorry. Yeah, that Simón notes herself, doesn't she, that she didn't know until much later on how her parents had died, actually. So when she was Frida, when she was, you know, 6 years old, it was this unknown thing for her. So that scene in the butchers, going back to what Rachel was saying earlier on, and you hear all of that rumor and all of those kind of misinformation about, and people, you know, gossiping about this, is so redolent, isn't it, of, you know, showing us now what was that reality at the time. But what is so great about that scene, as Rachel was saying, is that it doesn't focus on that. We hear that, but we don't see that necessarily. Apart from, I think there's one brief moment when the shot takes us further back and we see the adult speaking, don't we, just to give us a bit of context. But other than that, it's focused on chopping a chicken, and Frida, you know, pressed up against the glass watching, and then when she gets given the ham at the end of the conversation, I just found it was amusing when Anna, little Paola, is kind of just looking at his ham longingly, like any child would, you know. So you're distracted from, whilst at the same time listening and seeing. And I think it's amazing how the film does that. Kind of the audio visual is brought to us, you know, in two senses at the same time.
Absolutely. I'm just very conscious of the question that's in the chat box from Claire about the representation of menstruation in the film, which invariably is seldom portrayed in such an honest way. So I just wondered if anybody kind of had any initial thoughts about that, kind of what was a very kind of fleeting scene and glimpse of it, but obviously was quite powerful. I just wondered if anyone noted that. Sally? Yeah. Absolutely.
I think it nuances the portrait of Marga, doesn't it? But I wanted to link this up to the portrayal of blood more widely, I think, is really critical. We're talking about the virus and how it was spread. There's the key moment where Frida falls and bleeds, and this exposes the attitudes of the community, so that's really important. But also I wanted to mention, and I was talking about the role of violence in some of earlier films we've been talking about. I do think it is there in this film, and I wanted to remind you of the killing of the lamb by bloodletting, which I think it's quite hard to watch, especially as we realise that Frida is watching it and nobody is mediating that view for her, saying, don't worry, it doesn't hurt or something, which probably isn't true. Of course, this ties into Spanish pictorial tradition. It immediately made me think of that Zurbarán painting in the Prado. But it also did make me think of the 1965 Saura film called La Caza, where there's also a bloodletting in order to slaughter an animal, but that predicts and looks forward to the slaughter that's to do with the Spanish Civil War in that film that many of you might know. But of course, in this film, it's another piece in the jigsaw that we see Frida make in her head, and it comes out in the narrative when she finally asks Marga all those questions. Was my mother bleeding? She's been storing this up, and it's helping her interpret events. So that's not directly on the question. I think my response to that is that it's a fuller, more nuanced portrait of Marga and its placing of blood in various contexts, some of which are to do with disease, some of which are to do with animal husbandry, some of which are metaphorical in the sense of Spanish culture, but some of which are simply to do with the female body. So I think it's really interesting with regards blood. And then I was reading one of you earlier today, I think I've forgotten who, and they noted that fantastic early book about Spanish film, was this you, Rachel? Or perhaps it was you, Stuart, was actually published in 1993, and it was called Blood Cinema. So it's a book that explores violence. Who was it? Was it you, Stuart? Explores violence in Spanish film, and that all seems very pertinent.
Absolutely. So I've seen in the chat, yes, go ahead, Sarah, sorry. No, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to sort of, Sally, your comment was really evocative and made me think a lot of things that I can't articulate right now, but I think one of the things that really struck me when I don't think I had noticed the menstruation the first time I saw the film, or it certainly hadn't been my focus. And I think this time around watching it, I was more focused on Marga than I had been. I think I was much more interested in the children in my first few watchings around it. And I think the character of Marga is fascinating, and sort of her journey and the way that she relates to the children. And in that scene, I was really struck by the sort of openness with which she allowed Frida to have access to a topic that is generally considered to be taboo for children. And I think all of these different blood contexts that Sally laid out so well have to do with different taboos, because there's, this taboo of death and the slaughtering of the lamb, which a child in a rural environment is much more likely to be exposed to at an early age than a child in an urban environment. So on some level, maybe the lack of mediation is almost forgetting that Frida is coming from a place where she's perhaps not used to seeing animals be killed. And then the medical, I was also really struck by the scene at the doctor's where she's getting blood drawn, and it looked like the actress was actually getting blood drawn. I don't know if I'm not sure if that was true, but thinking about children and, tourniquets. And I just recently saw Dean Albritton, who's writing a book on AIDS in Spain, give a really great presentation about his book. And he's writing partially on the figure of the child with AIDS, who was often a hemophiliac in Spain. The first children with AIDS were usually suffering from hemophilia, and sort of that image of the child with the syringe of blood, and yet her blood taking on that sort of dangerous taboo potential in the scene of play where she skins her knee, and where it's so nuanced the way the film shows this sort of adult immediately sort of panic of like, don't touch her, don't touch her, don't touch her. And Frida almost doesn't understand why, and then comes to understand that this is somehow connected to the other taboo of the medicalized sort of. And so all of this sort of blood as manifestation of what shouldn't be talked about in front of children, but gets talked about in those whispered conversations, and the children pick it up anyway. And so I think that's a really interesting sort of constellation of taboos and their breaking in the film.
Absolutely. Does anybody else want to kind of pick up on this subject of breakage? Hello, Sarah. Yes.
Sorry, I'm used to Teams.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the blood is about taboo and about stigma, isn't it? And but it's also, I think, about risk, because you have this sense of the child who falls over and hurts her knee, is the risk to the other children, you know, that the kind of anxiety about the infected blood, but also just children who might fall over and how children present risk. And I was just thinking when Sally was speaking, because Sally's absolutely brilliant seminal piece about La Caza, you know, there's a lot to do. And it was interesting there that you said, Sally, storing this up, because you know, a lot of it is about this sort of very slow moving, everything's very contained, and there's something about this film that's kind of similar. And to me, because I was trying to think about what it is about the ending, whether we say it's cathartic or how we interpret it, what it is that causes us to react in that way. And so in a paper that I gave in Brown, that Sarah very happily invited me to go to Brown, which I was very happy to do, and I'm writing up at the moment. I'm trying to look at child performance and how Karen Lurie talks about the thing about children when they're on screen is that they present this risk because you don't know what they're going to do, you know. And so that, I think that was my kind of starting point for looking at child performance. And actually what Carla Simón says about this film is that there wasn't really that much risk involved, but she nevertheless manages to get these very natural performances from the children by using this method that she inherited from another film, that process that was put together to work with young children, where children are asked to repeat endlessly, and eventually the director will get the performance that they want. And I think that's really interesting because it brings in Stuart's work on play as well, this idea of you know, particularly when we think about the children dressing up in makeup, you know, that sort of idea of sort of imitation as play is kind of embedded within those performances as well. So this is a very roundabout way to bring all kinds of things together and put them in this sort of melting pot. But something to do with risk, I think, which doesn't really answer the question of menstruation, but there we are. I think the menstruation probably has to do with this idea of stigma and what's taboo, and as Sarah says.
Well, I'm guessing that it's obviously Frida's kind of witnessing of that moment where of the menstruation is. I keep coming back to this kind of word of awakenings, you know, and learning that's just constantly sort of subjected to in this film, and almost I kind of like see that her witnessing that kind of act as a projection of her adult self. I don't know, like what she might potentially will come hopefully to experience herself. I think that's quite important in kind of obviously resonating the child's self with what she's to become, you know, eventually, hopefully.
Yeah, and I think Stuart's written really interestingly about the idea of the child's gaze, you know, that we see in lots of other films, but that for Stuart, you know, there's a real sense of agency.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to elaborate, Stuart, better than I can.
Sorry, what point was I was reading the chat? Sorry.
So you say that rather than the child's gaze, you know, there's a real sense of agency about this child.
Yeah, I was kind of interested in thinking about that idea of childhood and orphans as well, of course, and the way in which they are figured as empties, emptied in some way, aren't they? And kind of how they then become as Delphi was saying, I suppose on a journey, a learning process of re-socialization or re-engagement with the world. It was interesting. When I was watching the film again yesterday, I really noticed how Frida, those first moments when she's out in the farmhouse or the house, that she touches everything, doesn't she? I don't know if you noticed, like she touches the tap, I think, doesn't she, before she goes to bed, and then the next morning you see her, she's touching the wall as she walks down the steps. And then I was thinking about it just before, because she was touching her blood as well, wasn't she, when Marga was, you know, cleaning her up and plastering her up as well. And there's a moment in that part of the conversation where she says, what happens if you put the hairdryer in the bath?
Oh yeah.
And I remember thinking, oh my God, what's she going to do? You know, the first time viewing, that was one thing I do remember from my first viewing of the film. And you do, because you and I kind of reflected on that when I was writing and thinking about it, you know, the orphan, because of that tradition of the orphan sometimes as the kind of cuckoo in the bird's nest, isn't it? You know, the orphan is this monstrous being that shouldn't be there and must be either rejected or rejects, of course, its parents. And I think that, and I'm sat here looking at Sarah and Sarah as, you know, the experts on child in cinema here, actually. So that kind of moment in the film, you know, there are kind of little things like that because the film is so gentle and quiet in other places, that you kind of latch onto, but it's actually a little bit of a red herring, isn't it, at times as well. But I'm interested to go back and think about touch and tactility, actually, next time I'm kind of thinking about this film.
Well, there's absolutely this it kind of fosters this concern with the haptic, doesn't it? And you know, both moments of it, I would say what I would call embodied and felt encounter, you know, between different, you know, that crosses kind of boundaries of generation, of gender, you know, but also kind of this overarching kind of preoccupation with the touch of the child in the way that they use touch to make sense of the world around them, you know. So for me, that bit with the tap was really kind of like, you know, she's 6 years old, and I thought back to my 6-year-old self and thought, would I have had the presence of mind to try and turn a tap off that was dripping? You know, I just wouldn't, probably not, do you know what I mean? And she obviously was kind of engaged with this kind of tap, and that it shouldn't be doing that, you know, and was making an effort to write something, do you know what I mean? And it was just presented to me as this way of her learning, you know, of making sense of the objects and things around her, you know, both in a domestic setting and outside. But yeah, there definitely is a concern here, a preoccupation with the touch, you know.
Yeah, and Sally's just very importantly put in the chat, the scratching, isn't it? The eczema that turns out to be an allergy. Yeah, no, that's a really good point, actually.
Absolutely. Santiago Forza Hernandez has said also, as a comment mostly out of curiosity, I wonder why Vigas Luna, I don't know, is often ignored in studies of childhood Spanish cinema. I don't know if anyone wants to kind of answer Santiago's query.
Stop it.
Sorry.
That's not a film that I've seen, Santiago, so I'm afraid that I can't comment, but I wondered if anybody else would like to pick up on that question. I'm just conscious of covering things that are in the chat. I don't want anyone to feel ignored.
I can't comment on it, but maybe someone else can. But just to pick out something else Santiago has mentioned is that after the event, I will send on useful links and share the recording. So, and I wanted to also mention, in terms of if we're looking at links to other films, and I know we've mentioned this El Espíritu de la Colmena, and obviously Cría Cuervos. I was just talking with Ben in the chat about another film I've sat in Ben's cinema, well, the cinema where does his cinema work, and cried my eyes out at the Florida Project. And that's another film that uses kind of touch and the colour palette, as Ben was saying, about to centralise the child's experience of loss, I would say, and upheaval and dramatic change. So I welcome any comments on sort of links between other films, because I'm sure, and Raquel's point on Las Niñas, I kind of like doing this comparative viewing of films.
Well, Rachel, I mean, sorry. I mean, I just wrote down throughout the films that for some reason I could not stop thinking about when viewing this were Call Me by Your Name, Los Amantes del Círculo Polar, Lovers of the Arctic Circle, and Viridiana. So 3 very, very different films, but that kept kind of coming up, you know, in my brain again and again as being somehow kind of resonating with me. I don't know if it was to do with their structure of feeling or the way that they were filmed, or kind of the similar-ish topics being broached, you know, on a wider scale of awakening and realization, youth awakening. But Idiana in particular, with the young girl kind of witnessing, you know, on looking on certain acts. I can't remember, Sally, I studied it with you many, many years ago. You know, witnessing things like, I think between the uncle and Viridiana, you know, so those were the kind of the 3 films that kept on coming up again and again for me, Rachel, just to kind of echo that, your sentiment there. I don't know if anybody else kind of made them think of specific texts they've seen, or Sally.
I think both Raquel and Ben had points to possibly feed in.
Come on, Raquel.
Well, I was thinking, because I'm mostly focused on contemporary cinema, how we're used to know all these classics that go back to certain moments of time in Spanish history, like the Civil War. Pan's Labyrinth is a classic in that sense, and I was thinking about Pan's Labyrinth quite a lot. The Forest, you know, things happening with fantasy. I was actually wondering, could we talk about Estiu as a fairy tale film? I don't know. Anyway, but I also noticed that maybe younger directors, the new generation, are focusing on the 90s, which I don't think it's been represented in hindsight so much. We've got a lot of great cinema from the 90s, so we can see that era, but all this, like Luis López Carrasco with El Año del Descubrimiento, which is a documentary, but goes back to that year, 1992, which was so important because we were kind of told that that was the best year ever with the Olympics and the Expo. And we see, I think, Rachel, you mentioned that Kobe t-shirt that Frida is wearing the Olympics, and also Las Niñas. And I don't know, just I'm quite excited about, because as we were talking about, I lived through this period, but I didn't know anything about anything back then. So it's a good way for me to revisit those events from a similar perspective.
Sally, did you have a point? Because thank you, Raquel.
I wondered if Ben did.
I had another film that I was going to drop in that I thought I only saw last week for the first time in preparation for this, but that had striking similarities with this film, and that was Ponette, the French film.
It's funny you should say that, actually. Sorry to interrupt. The director cites this film as a direct influence.
Doesn't surprise me. There were just umpteen moments in Ponette that are repeated in summer 1993. Even little things like when Anna is left in the woods on her own, she breaks her left arm, and the little girl in Ponette's got a broken left arm for the whole film. There's a similar scene in a playground. There are similar scenes with little shrines and the god room and trying to get in touch with the lost mother. And is it Stuart, where you mentioned shame earlier? Because there's an element of obviously in summer 1993 there is the whole thing of the fact that the parents have died from AIDS and potentially from drug abuse in the past is a shameful thing for that little girl. And the little girl in Ponette, her mother is killed in a car accident, which is what leaves the girl with the broken arm. And the father kind of shames the mother at the start of the film as she was stupid, she shouldn't have got you driven so fast, and she should have put the seatbelt on you. And it's really interesting that those two little kids have got a view of their mother as being somehow shameful. It's just, if you haven't seen Ponette, it's fantastic. Very, very similar. And that's I think she was 4, the little girl in that. So there's the discussion about what is acting when you're only a 4-year-old child, but her performance, in inverted commas, is amazing. She's absolutely fantastic. Really, really good. It's 1990 something as well, I think.
It's so interesting you should mention that, Ben. I'll just jump in there quickly, and then Sally can speak. That I interviewed the director of photography of Summer 1993, and I went in there all like, Crea Cuervo, so many influences, so excited. And he said that Carla had more highlighted to him when they were going through and looking at the photographs of her childhood, that the film that you mentioned is more of an influence. And then afterwards, sort of in the post discussion, she brings in Crea Cuervo, and she brings in other films.
It's quite a washed out film, like those 80s photographs that we've seen, or 90s photographs of Carla and her mother. So yeah, it makes perfect sense.
I just wanted to, again, I'm mindful of some of the films that I know some of the students and A-level students on the call might be interested in. And I wondered if we might talk about religion. Ben, you just mentioned The Shrine, and I've not seen that film, but I've made a note to add it to the list. I'd love to hear others' views, and if there's anything from the audience. On Raquel, you just talked about fantasy fairy tale and the play with religion. I mean, in El Laberinto del Fauno, we just see one priest, I think, but other films that are studied at A level, like La Historia Oficial, the Argentine film, shows the collusion of the Catholic Church. And Delphi, thank you for bringing up another of my favorite 1960s Spanish films, Viridiana. But I do think you have a point there, that when Rita climbs the tree and is witness to events between uncle and niece that she can't understand, and that's quite a key moment. But maybe it's the religion as well. And I wonder if we might focus it by thinking about the mother. I'm absolutely fascinated by the mother of Nels, is it, in this film, and everything she represents, and how it begins with, we talked about imitation and the process of performance, the way she's getting Frida to say the Lord's Prayer, that versus the shrine in the forest with the Virgin. So we're not turning the page from Catholicism, the Virgin Mary's still there, but in such a different mode. And then, of course, the other mother, the menstruating mother, Marga. I wondered if those of you that have worked on motherhood and femininity might comment, and that might be relevant to some of the films people on the call are interested in too.
That's open, absolutely open to the floor.
Okay, I think Stuart needs to tell us about magical thinking. I mean, you know, because I think this kind of brings these ideas together. Because there's the difference between the grandparents, as you say, saying, you know, you need to recite the Lord's Prayer, and then this, you know, this shrine to the Virgin that Frida, you know, leaves some cigarettes there to sort of conjure up her dead mother, if you like. But I think Stuart needs to come in and to explain this, if he's willing.
I think it's Rachel, actually, you'll be wanting to hear more from. I think it's Rachel, isn't it? You draw on that idea of the magical thinking.
Yes, so I've actually drawn on this from Sarah's article and applied the magical thinking that she applies to a Peruvian film. And I was reading The Shrine as kind of how Frida transforms a religious kind of intergenerational tension practice, as it were, into a playing practice, a kind of playful that combines her understanding of how she can communicate and how she can navigate, and that becomes a form of agency for her. But actually, I think Sarah Thomas might speak to the magical thinking kind of element of the film, perhaps, and the transitional part of girlhood, I would say, that you talk about towards in the end of your book.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, by the way, also, Rachel, I discovered your excellent article yesterday with on this film in Cría Cuervos. It's so fantastic. So congratulations. And I do think, it's funny because I had written about magical thinking in Las Malas Intenciones, this Peruvian film, a while ago, and I had not seen it in this film in the same way, but I think you illuminate it really beautifully. And I think that the shrine is a locus of so much. And you see actually in a lot of these child-centered films, I mean, obviously Laberinto del Fauno, which has come up several times, there's a sort of much more overt kind of fantasy of this magical world where the child protagonist has a kind of agency she doesn't have necessarily in the world where she is forced to live. You see this in Cría Cuervos to a certain degree with the ritual that the protagonist performs when her guinea pig dies, and the way that sort of Catholicism, I think, as several people have said, sort of gets inflected onto a kind of more imaginative, more mythical, more fairy tale kind of way of thinking in the child. I mean, and this is very much I think, accurate from my memories of my own childhood subjectivity representation of the way children think, is they kind of remix and bring together these influences. Well, this is what we do at church, and this is what that funeral was like, and this is what I imagine in my games. And I think that I was really struck rewatching the film by the space of the shrine and by the way that, I think also having read your piece, both and Stuart's piece recently, I think thinking about the connection that Frida is still trying to draw to her mother, and when she puts the cigarettes on the shrine, and she says, and like, these will make her really happy. And so there's this kind of idea that, this is like a portal to her mother in whatever afterlife there is in her mind, where she's giving up these offerings as a way of forging a connection. And you see this in Cría Cuervos too, with the sort of summoning of the mother when she's falling asleep. And to connect back to something Delphi said at the beginning of the session, I think also a reminder that this trauma, this is only the beginning of a grieving process and the beginning of a kind of repetitive, whether it's magical thinking, mourning, sort of connection drawing, that moment of catharsis at the end of the film shows that she has kind of accepted the reality of the death, but that it's only going to be a complete, or started to accept the reality of the death, but it's the beginning, not the end of the grief and of the trauma. And I think that those little rituals are a really sort of potent reminder of that in the film.
Can I just say, oh, sorry, Sarah, no, you go first because panelists take priority. Absolutely. Go ahead.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Really quick, it was just to say that I think Stuart and also Ryan, who you had on the last panel, have written about Marcelino Pan y Vino, and I think that there's certainly echoes of what Sarah was saying in that film. It'd be an interesting one to compare to this, where the little boy goes up and sort of invokes this Christ figure, but ultimately again it's in order to reach his dead mother.
Yeah, I mean, kind of linked to that really, there's this concept that I've come across, in PTSD treatment, because I have PTSD, called associations. And the therapist said that that actually these moments that we have, where in passing we might think of something that's totally out of place, or totally not linked to what we're doing now, are actually the most important and are actually crucial to our processes of processing and placing traumatic experiences, right? So it kind of something, if we're experiencing something traumatic now, like grief post-trauma, but actually these associations help us go back, and it happens on a subconscious level, right? Because it happens while we sleep. But I think that the role play in particular between Frida and Anna, and this kind of acts of, these kind of calls on magic and fantasy, is representative of kind of a visualization, making visible these kind of associations that Frida is now having in order to process, kind of on a latent subconscious level, right, the trauma that she's experiencing from the death of her mum. So obviously Anna is unaware that Frida is actually playing the role of mother here, in that dialogue. But I think that that's something that I would call personally an association. coming from my own experience. Somebody else might disagree, but I think that that's absolutely inextricably linked to this notion of, to her experience of PTSD, really. I don't know if anyone would disagree, but
no, I think a lot of what you're saying there, Delphi, is very, very resonant, and it made me think of that image of, so it's very technological, isn't it, holding this up to the camera, but that iconic image, because it's obviously from that moment of the playing, isn't it, and you know, and the makeup, but that image itself just looks so otherworldly and linking back to the fairy tale motif as well, doesn't it? And we know that that's an image that the makeup is there's a photo of Carla Simón in that that was reproduced in one of the newspaper or kind of interviews you know, online that I managed to find. I don't know if others have seen that image, but she's got the same kind of very bright red cheeks, she's got the same kind of blue, you know, and so yeah, I think that image itself speaks, doesn't it, partly to something we touched on earlier on, which is Carla Simón's own processing of the grief. And you know, I don't know who chose that image as opposed to the one that's on the proper DVD inside my cardboard sleeve one. Yeah, which is such a different image, isn't it? It's so, they're so contrasting in terms of what you expect from a film, what you might see in that film. I thought that was just fascinating. But you know, this one, yeah, I think in my article I've described it as otherworldly and atemporal and kind of, you know, removed from any kind of real place. And I think in my first draft of the essay I also described it as queer, and I ended up taking that word out because it just had too much resonance in other ways in the article. I didn't have space and time to think about it, but it made me think about thinking about normative strangeness and Catherine Bond Stockton's writing about the queer child, and how, you know, Frida is in many ways kind of representative of that kind of strangeness, all the things we've been talking about before about otherness and being different, and you know, and coming in. Apologies if you can hear music in the background, by the way. It's my daughter having a music lesson.
It's part and parcel of the age of working from home. Yeah, absolutely. No, I totally agree that she almost on that cover looked like an elf or like a gnome type thing to me. You know, that's what I was expecting. Ben, did you?
No, I think she looks like Puck. It's like something from Midsummer Night's Dream.
Absolutely, yeah, totally.
I was just going to say, Delphi, on Sally's point, I wonder if there's something to be said about Sally was talking about the mother of Nels, and how she is very talking about costume and dressing up, and sort of Stuart's point about when Nels's mother comes, she comes with these dresses that are very like prim and proper little dresses for them to wear, and a lot of the scenes of her speak to this kind of changing intergenerational tension between kind of what their attitudes were for what Nels, how she should have behaved, and how she should have raised her children. And that scene at the dinner table when I was researching the game they're playing. It's called something like Elsa Sklops de San Juan or something like that, and they pass the napkin round, and that's all the play scene, and then that's contrasted with this very dramatic display of these international tension. And I wonder, I don't know, maybe Raquel, that you noticed in Las Niñas as well, and this kind of difference in views on in the post-crisis of the AIDS epidemic.
Yeah, well, I've actually watched both films this weekend. I don't know why, and I watched them with my mom, and it was interesting to contrast our opinions. And about Las Niñas, she was not as engaged as me because she identified with the mother, with Natalia de Molina, a bit more, and she missed on all the details like that you can see in Las Niñas that are so iconic in that generation. But going back to the scene about Frida playing her mom, just because I was watching it with my mom, we watched it dubbed in Castilian instead of Catalan. She just asked me to do that, which is fine. But I noticed the kind of language that Frida was using. And in that kind of game, which is, we call it mamas y papas, moms and dads, I noticed that she's using a language which is not only very adult, but also from that generation, because she's saying something like, estoy cantidad de cansada. And I mean, we don't even say that anymore, but it's very from the 90s. So like, oh yeah, I'm dead tired or something like that. And Anna doesn't understand it because she wants to play the game properly, and she's missing it. So I was thinking how, Frida interprets motherhood from her own experience without judging it, of course. And I was, maybe anyone wants to pick up on this, because I think it's quite interesting that we see Marga as her new mom, but we see glimpses of the old mom. And what is the film trying to say in that sense? I'd be very interested in hearing comments of that.
Anybody want to take Raquel's points forward? No?
Well, I guess I was struck watching it by some of the sort of intergenerational, the way that it's so clear that the grandparents are portrayed as these sort of bourgeois, religious, old school, traditional Catalan sort of bourgeoisie, who are scandalized by the way that their children, some of their children have turned out. And there are all these kind of side comments that are made. And I think they say something in that same dinner table fight or at another point to Esteva, like, and you almost turned out the same way, right? The sort of implication of like, you two degenerate, you know, whether it's because they used drugs or they didn't, you know, study or whatever expectations there had been set on them by that sort of class position and sort of social position, that they sort of, you know, have chosen to go live out in the country, and that Naus has died. And thinking about then how it translates into their relationship with the grandchildren and the sort of like spoiling of Frida and wanting her to come back to the city and sort of have a different, perhaps a different kind of relationship with her than the seemingly authoritarian relationship they had with their own children that didn't go well. And especially the mother, right? Because I think it's a very paternalistic, that type of bourgeois family is very patriarchal, but it's actually the matriarch who has the strongest sort of personality, and it's the grandfather who's usually saying like, it's fine, or let's go, or leave it. And just those different models of, at some point someone said something, I was thinking about this constellation of maternal figures where you have the grandmother, you have Naus who's sort of absent and present at the same time, you have Marga who's having to take on sort of a new child in addition to her biological child. And then the sort of figure of the Virgin Mary in the shrine, and sort of that constellation was really interesting, and thinking about in an almost sociological frame how the different Spanish generations thinking. If Naus, I think that card from her first communion was 1963, something like that. So Naus would have been born late 50s, early 60s, something like that. And so the parents are probably, you know, from the very, I don't know, 30s, maybe are the children who lived through the Civil War. Just thinking about all of like that sort of historical component in the autobiographical is fascinating. And just to second some of what Stuart was saying about the image of Frida, there's on the DVD that I have, there's an extra that is like Imágenes de la Infancia de Carla or something like that. It's like a slide, and it's a slideshow that puts her childhood photographs alongside sort of stills from the film to see how many of the things were so meticulously recreated, like the beach club or the swimming pool popsicle. There's a picture of her with a popsicle, that makeup image that we see, the bathtub that's a different color but the same bathtub. So anyway, it's just really interesting to sort of map this onto an actual social historical frame via the autobiographical. So I just rambled, I'll stop.
Oh. Can I jump in a second? Sorry. I wanted to, and Rachel mentioned the little dresses, and then Sarah's just mentioned as well, in those photos, the one that really stung this time round when I watched it, I'd had a look at those comparisons, is there's a photo of Carla and her cousin in a blue and pink nightie that are exactly the same. And like a lot of the photos, the feeling is right, but the clothes aren't accurate, or it's not 100%. But it's so accurate of they have to be a blue and a pink nightie that when I watch the film again, it feels like that's a really critical scene for Carla. That's a moment where it's only a minor thing of showing that she's not grateful for that nightie, but it's like it stuck with her that she really offended her grandmother, and that she soils the nightie and they have to go and wash them. And there's a photo of her and her cousin washing stuff by hand as well. It's like it must have been a really important bit, and it makes you think of all those things that you have yourself where to everyone else it's probably not important, but there's a moment in your life where something happened that comes back every now and again and it stings because you should have done something differently, and that feels like that's a really critical one for her. It's a great scene as well. I love that.
Yeah, and they also links back to what Raquel said about maybe it's fairy tale like, because later then Frida's made to go and clean the dress, and she says, "Oh, they have me like Cinderella." So I think she says she makes some kind of comparison that she's like the running around and cleaning up after everyone. I just think it reminds me so much of myself as a child.
Yeah,
being such a little diva. But yes, that scene stuck with me as well. And the images, I think Claire's asking in the chat, they are on the DVD extra, so there's 2 DVDs that come with the case, but I can try and locate some that are available and share with everyone if possible. But it's really interesting if you look at the photographs from Carla's youth.
okay, thank you. I'm just drawing my attention back to the chat because Rachel's kind of reiterated there's a question from Fiona, and I think it links back to something that Raquel was saying earlier, and she's asked, do you think we can read this historical impulse to revisit the 90s and the post-92 moment as a sort of new memory boom? Is this something we see in other contemporary Spanish films? And I was just wondering, you know, if somebody wanted to provide some sort of a perspective or answer.
I could say something briefly, but I just spoke, so I also don't want to steal the palabra from anyone else. Okay. I think 1992 is becoming a really interesting inflection point in Spanish cultural studies more broadly, not necessarily just cinema. I think there was an issue of the Journal of Spanish Cultural Studies about 1992 that came out maybe in the last year. And I think that as the sort of focus on the transition, which was, there was a sort of historical memory more broadly, then there was a kind of phase where the transition was a key point. It remains, I think, a key point of interest in Spanish cinema and culture. But there have been some really interesting things coming out around this, as you know, Raquel was saying, and Stuart, I think several people mentioned 1992 as this really sort of pivotal, symbolic year of, you know, the Expo in Sevilla, the Olympics in Barcelona, the 500 years of the discovery, entre muchas comillas, of the Americas. No, and so I think that's become a sort of interesting point of attention in critical work on Spanish culture. And I think that even though it's strange, because I'm a little older than Frida, and I find it sort of still shocking that we could be studying a period that I lived in, but it's because I'm getting older. So I think 1992 feels recent, but actually now when we think about it, it is 30 years ago at this point.
Oh,
so
don't.
Sorry. Almost 30, not quite. So I think that there's been, I've noticed with interest, you know, several studies coming out on that. In terms of other films that are representing this period, I can't think off the top of my head, but I feel like there must be. I don't know if anyone else has any references in that frame.
Raquel, yeah.
Just to mention quickly the work of Alberto Rodriguez, the director of Sevilla, just because I don't know this off the top of my head either. I just looked into this yesterday. A couple of films, especially Grupo Siete and the Man with 1,000 Faces, El Hombre de las Mil Caras, that are kind of going over that period, 1992, as the start of the crisis, and also corruption, institutional corruption. But I just wanted to mention those.
Well, thank you. That's really helpful. Perhaps we could pop them in the chat, shall I, Rachel, for other people to look at as points of reference in answer to Fiona's question. That would be really useful. Sally, yes.
Just to say quickly, I'm thinking not of films, contemporary films about that decade. I'm thinking about the continued relevance of films from that decade. Remember, it really was a boom decade for Spanish cinema. Almodovar obviously in ascendance, Medem, but quite apart from the big male names, this was a fantastic decade for the arrival of female directors in Spain. And indeed, sadly, the promise that the decade of the 1990s contained with regards to female directors. I'm thinking about Itiar Boyain, all the big names, Chus Gutierrez, Azucena Rodriguez. In fact, the promise of that decade then wasn't, very sadly, very unfortunately, for various reasons, delivered in the new millennium. So there's, I think, I'm talking about a critical interest in going back and seeing what we were doing right in terms of feminism and female voice and female directors in the 90s, and what we need to do again to recover those successes. I don't have a brain that can remember stats, but the stats are really impressive for the absolute shooting up of the number of female directors precisely in the 1990s. And I, or somebody on the call, could go off and Google it, but perhaps I'll send that to you, Rachel, so we can add it when this becomes a recording, and hopefully of some use if anyone listens to it.
Thank you, Sally.
I was going to say, I agree with you, Sally. Sorry, just to jump in about one of my favourite films actually is El Calentito. And I think that's quite an interesting one if you're looking at trajectories of childhood, girlhood, womanhood in a way. I don't know, there's something there, isn't it? I haven't quite teased it out, but I love El Calentito, which is Chus Gutierrez.
I think Chus as well has written, not written, why am I using the term written? Directed that film, I can't remember what it was, that was about, I think it was about female migrants or female, you know, citizens in Spain, you know, from a minority collective or whatever you'd like to call it. And I found that in my own research, perhaps it's no accident that a lot of kind of women directors have tried to unearth these sort of narratives about race, women of different races in Spain, you know, that have often kind of been excised perhaps from other narratives elsewhere, or treated in a very kind of stereotypical or subcomplex way. So I think Chus is one of them, potentially to bear in mind, you know, tangentially linked to this discussion. I've seen her speak actually and about their film, and it was very, very enlightening, but perhaps we could add that into sort of a references list, Rachel. I don't know if that would be useful. I'm just thinking, does anybody Retorna a la Ansala. Maybe it was Fiona. I cannot remember now. But perhaps. Yes. I was just wondering if there's any more kind of questions from anybody who's listening, or if anybody wants to drop anything in the chat that's not had a chance to yet. I'm just conscious that, you know, some people might have put things in that have been missed, but I cannot see anything. So. Rachel, do you want to kind of?
I can, yes. Thank you so much for being a fantastic chair, and thank you
no problem.
for being a great colleague and friend as we've embarked on doing this film festival. And thank you very much to all the panelists here today so enthusiastically. It's actually been a real joy and delight to do these kinds of things. As I was saying about working with Sally and Ben at various film screenings and festivals, I love having the Q&A afterwards and having a discussion about it, because, you know, then you sort of you go off and you don't it's like the parenthesis from reality, but actually it's better to have these kind of discussions afterwards and talk through. So I'm really glad that you were all so willing and able to do this, and it's been a real pleasure to talk with you about all the work that you do. So thank you everyone for coming along. Thank you to those attendees in the chat. Thank you for the excellent sharing, Delphi, and please do go and check out this film. Is still screening until the 24th, so tell your friends and come along to the next Q&A, which is next Monday. Details are on the same Eventbrite for Pelo Malo, which will have some other fantastic colleagues discussing the film. I can record this as well. Thanks again, everyone.
Oh, thank you so much, Rachel, and hopefully this has helped you in your writing. You know that it's given you some useful points of reference and material, which is obviously vital. So hopefully that's helped you as well. But thank you so much, and thank you so much for letting me chair, and I hope I haven't talked too much. But it's been an absolute pleasure to meet everybody, albeit virtually, and glad you're keeping well and somewhat staying sane through activities like this. So it's really heartwarming. Thank you for organising it, Rachel. You've done a fantastic job.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care of yourselves.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
You take care.